Chapter 1: Permafrost and Pretense. The bus groaned, its tires slushing through the gray melt of a Siberian spring. For 6 hours, the view beyond the grimy window was an unchanging scroll of larch trees and sodden earth. Julian Croft watched it pass, not with a tourist's appreciation but with an artist's hunger. He saw the way the pale sunlight failed to penetrate the dense woods, the way the snow clung stubbornly in the shadows, a geography of despair. It was perfect. He practiced the expression in the reflection, a tightening around the eyes, a slight downturn of the mouth, the face of a poet staring at his own executioner. He was here for a role, the part of a lifetime. Dmitri Volkov, a dissident poet broken on the wheel of a totalitarian state in a film titled The Iron Verses. He wasn't here to see ghosts. He was here to steal the feeling of the place, to wear its history like a second skin. The bus geared down, its engine whining in protest as it turned onto a narrow, unpaved road. The final approach. Branches, heavy with damp, scraped against the sides of the vehicle like skeletal fingers. And then the trees fell away. It didn't rise so much as it oppressed. The sanatorium, now rebranded as the Red Horizon Retreat, was a monument to brutalism. A colossal 9-story block of prefabricated concrete panels, stained dark with decades of weeping frost. Its lines were severe, its windows were uniform, vacant eyes in a face of stone. It was a weapon designed to crush the human spirit with geometry. "End of the line," the driver grunted, not bothering to turn around. Julian pulled his suitcase from the overhead rack and joined the small trickle of other guests disembarking. The air hit him first. It was clean but heavy, weighted with the scent of cold iron and wet earth. A murder of rooks exploded from the building's parapet, their calls echoing in the vast silence. They circled once, black specks against a sky the color of lead, before settling again. He spotted the other members of his strange pilgrimage. An American, loud and draped in camera gear, was already filming. "What's up, subscribers? Ben Carter here, coming at you live from the literal creepiest place on earth. Smash that like button, you guys are not gonna wanna miss this." A young woman stood apart from the others, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her coat. She had dark, watchful eyes and held herself with a stillness that suggested she was listening to something no one else could hear. Lena Marku. They had exchanged a few pleasantries at the depot in Yakutsk. A history student, she had said. The main doors hissed open, revealing a man who seemed assembled from the same severe angles as the building. He was tall, thin, and wore a simple black suit that hung on his frame. His smile was a fixed, placid thing that did not reach his pale eyes. "Welcome," he said, his voice smooth and devoid of any discernible accent. "I am Mr. Vadian. It is a pleasure to have you at the Red Horizon Retreat. Please come inside. The taiga can be inhospitable." The lobby was cavernous and cold. The floor was polished concrete. The walls were bare save for a line of stern, oversized portraits of Soviet-era officials. The only warmth came from a single, bare bulb hanging from a long cord above a Spartan reception desk. The air inside was stale, layered with the smells of boiled cabbage, dust, and something else, something metallic and faintly antiseptic, like a long-abandoned hospital ward. Mr. Vadian handed out keys attached to heavy brass fobs. You will find your accommodations are simple, in keeping with the historical authenticity of the location. Dinner is at 1900 hours in the main canteen. Please do not wander into the cordoned-off sections. The building is old. We would not wish for any accidents. His eyes lingered on Ben Carter, whose camera was panning across the peeling plaster of the ceiling. Julian's room was on the 7th floor, room 73. The corridor was long, illuminated by weak, caged lights that cast more shadow than illumination. His footsteps echoed. The door opened with a squeal of protesting metal. The room was a cell, a narrow bed with a thin mattress on a rusted iron frame, a small wooden desk and chair, a single, large window that refused to open more than an inch, barred on the outside. The concrete walls were painted a sickly green, and the air was thick with the ghost of cheap tobacco. He dropped his suitcase and walked to the window. From this height, he could see over the immediate tree line to the unending expanse of the Siberian taiga, a green and gray ocean that stretched to the curve of the earth. There was nothing else. No roads, no other buildings, no sign of human life. The isolation was absolute. He breathed in, savoring the feeling. This was the solitude his character, Dmitri, would have endured. This was the silence that would have filled his head, leaving room only for the verses that would condemn him. He turned his attention to the room itself, his actor's senses cataloging every detail. The scrape marks on the floor beneath the bed, the faint, dark stain on the wall near the headboard. He ran his hand over the rough wool blanket, then let his fingers trail along the cold, pitted surface of the iron bed frame. A jolt, not of electricity but of sensation. It was sharp, cold, and shot up his arm to the base of his skull. For a fraction of a second the room blurred. The scent of tobacco intensified, mingled with the acrid smell of sweat and fear. He snatched his hand away, a gasp catching in his throat. He stood frozen for a moment, his heart hammering against his ribs. He shook his head, a short, sharp motion of dismissal. It's the place, he told himself. The atmosphere. My mind is already working, building the character. It was a good sign. It meant he was connecting. He unpacked slowly, laying his clothes in the small wardrobe, placing his script and a notepad on the desk. He needed to capture that feeling, that phantom jolt. He sat on the edge of the stiff mattress and read one of Dmitri's lines aloud, pitching his voice lower, rougher. "You can break my bones," he recited, his voice a low growl in the quiet room, "but you cannot break the words. They are not mine to give you." A sound from the wall, scrabble, scrabble, like a rat, sharp and frantic. Julian fell silent, listening. The sound was gone. He stood and pressed his ear against the cold concrete, hearing nothing but the faint, distant hum of the building's ancient systems. He straightened up, frowning. Outside the window, a rook landed on the iron bars. It tilted its head, its black eye a polished bead of obsidian. It opened its beak, and a sound came out, not the harsh caw he expected, but a guttural, croaking syllable that sounded unnervingly like a word. A Russian word. Davy. The rook launched itself from the bars and disappeared into the gray sky. Julian stared after it, the single, harsh word echoing in the profound silence of room 73. Chapter 2. An Audience of Rooks. The canteen was a study in oppressive functionality. Long wooden tables stood in severe rows on the concrete floor. The air, thick with the smell of boiled potatoes and stewed meat, did little to mask the underlying scent of disinfectant. A single strip of fluorescent lighting flickered overhead, casting a pale, clinical light that made everyone look unwell. Julian sat with Lena Marcoux, mostly because she was the quietest option. Ben Carter was holding court at another table, loudly narrating his dining experience for a small camera propped against a salt shaker. "All right, people, we are about to sample authentic Gulag chic cuisine," Ben announced to his invisible audience. "Smells like my grandma's basement, but hey, when in Russia, right?" Lena picked at her stew, a thick brown concoction with unidentifiable lumps of meat. "He is. A lot," she said, her voice soft. "He's a caricature," Julian replied, pushing a potato around his plate. He was trying to eat as Dmitri would, slowly, deliberately, as if each mouthful might be his last. He sees this place as a stage for his performance. The irony was not lost on him. "And you?" she asked, her dark eyes studying him with an unnerving perception. "Why are you here, Mr. Croft?" "I'm an actor, preparing for a part." The brochure said this was a place for digital detox and historical contemplation, she said, a faint, skeptical smile touching her lips. "I don't think many people come here for that." "Why did you come here, Lena?" Her smile vanished. She looked down at her plate. "My great-uncle, he was an inmate here from 1951 until the records stop in 1953. I am a historian. I wanted to see the place where he spent his final years." "I'm sorry," Julian said, a genuine note of sympathy in his voice. "What did he do?" "He was a poet." The word hung in the air between them. Julian felt a strange, prickling sensation on the back of his neck. "A poet," he repeated. "His name was Ivan Koslov. His work was hopeful. The state decided hope was a form of treason." Mr. Vaudian glided between the tables, his placid smile firmly in place. He stopped beside them, his hands clasped behind his back. "I trust the meal is to your satisfaction." "It is. Authentic," Lena offered. "Authenticity is our primary goal," Vaudian said, his gaze sweeping the room. This room, the canteen, was not merely for dining. It was a space for re-education. Dr. Gennady Volkov, the sanatorium's first chief psychiatrist, believed that communal dining was essential for observing and correcting antisocial tendencies. He would stand right there, Vaudian pointed to a corner of the room, and watch the inmates for hours. He claimed he could diagnose a man's descent by the way he held his spoon. The manager's words seemed to chill the air further. Julian watched the corner Vaudian had indicated, half expecting to see an imprint of the man left on the peeling paint. Later, sleep did not come easily. Julian lay on the stiff mattress, the unfamiliar silence of the sanatorium pressing in on him. He ran his lines in his head, trying to find Dmitri's voice, his rhythm. He must have drifted off because the room dissolved, not into the gentle darkness of sleep, but into a jarring, sensory overload. He was standing, bare feet on freezing concrete. The rough, scratchy fabric of a burlap uniform chafed his skin. The air was frigid and smelled of urine and stale fear. A single bare bulb hung from a wire overhead, swinging slightly, casting a dizzying, hypnotic pattern of light and shadow on the damp stone walls. He was in a cell, smaller and fouler than his room. A voice, not his own, began to speak inside his head. It was a recitation, a frantic, desperate torrent of words in Russian, verses of poetry. He did not understand the language, but he understood the cadence, the burning fury and unbreakable will behind the words. "I will not be the rust on your cage," the voice raged. "I am the key." He felt a phantom pain erupt in his right hand, a sharp, grinding agony in the knuckles. He looked down and saw a hand, his hand, yet not his hand, pounding against a solid steel door, the skin split and bleeding. He was not in control. He was a passenger in his own body, a spectator to a memory. The dream shifted. He was in an interrogation room, the light even brighter, searing his retinas. A man's face, indistinct and shadowed, loomed over him. A question was asked. The voice in his head answered with another line of poetry. A searing pain exploded across his jaw. Julian woke with a violent jerk, sitting bolt upright in the bed. He was drenched in sweat, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The room was dark, silent. The dream was gone, but the feelings remained, clinging to him like a shroud. The cold, the pain, the rage. His right hand throbbed with a dull, aching pain. He fumbled for the lamp on his bedside table, his fingers clumsy. He clicked it on. He stared at his hand. The knuckles were raw, scraped red, with tiny flecks of green paint embedded in the skin. He scrambled out of bed and looked at the wall next to the door. There, at waist height, were fresh scrapes in the paint, gouges that matched the injuries on his hand perfectly. He stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I did that. I did that in my sleep." He went to the small desk, his notepad lying open next to his script. There, scrawled across a blank page, were several lines of Cyrillic script. The handwriting was sharp, angular, and utterly alien. It was not his. A movement at the window caught his eye. He turned, his body rigid. On the iron bars outside, a dozen rooks were perched, their dark forms silhouetted against the pre-dawn glow. They were perfectly still, a silent, black-feathered jury, and they were all watching him. He backed away until he hit the opposite wall, his eyes wide with a terror that was new and profound. He walked slowly toward the small, cracked mirror above the wash basin. He needed to see his own face. He needed to ground himself. He stared at his reflection. His face was pale, his hair matted with sweat. For a terrifying, heart-stopping second, something was wrong. The eyes looking back at him were not his own. They were darker, older, and filled with a burning, defiant fire he had never seen before. A stranger stared out from his own face. Then he blinked and it was gone. It was just him. Julian Croft, an actor, alone in a cold room in the middle of Siberia. He was panting, his knuckles throbbing, staring at his own terrified expression. But the image of that other man's eyes was burned into his mind. Chapter 3: Footsteps in the Infirmary. The next morning, Mr. Vadian led the official tour. He walked with a slow, deliberate glide, his voice a calm monotone as he pointed out the features of the retreat. He showed them the library, where all the books were hollowed out. He showed them the small courtyard, enclosed on all sides by 9 stories of concrete, where inmates were permitted 30 minutes of sunlight a day. Ben Carter followed him like a jackal, his camera capturing every detail. "And here we have the exercise yard, folks," he narrated in a hushed, dramatic whisper. "Can you imagine? Hundreds of poor souls walking in circles, their hopes and dreams turning to dust. Super, super creepy. I'm getting some wild EMF readings here." Lena trailed at the back of the group, her face pale. She kept her arms crossed tightly, as if trying to physically hold herself together against the oppressive weight of the place. Julian stayed close to her. He had concealed his scraped knuckles, but he couldn't hide the tremor in his hands or the dark circles under his eyes. He felt a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety, a background static against which every sharp noise was a jolt. He kept glancing at the rooks, who seemed to follow them, hopping from one window ledge to another as the tour progressed through the building. "And this," Vadian announced, pushing open a set of heavy, steel-clad doors, "was the medical wing, Dr. Volkov's personal domain." The air that billowed out was colder than the rest of the building and carried a sharp chemical smell. Formaldehyde and ozone. The infirmary was a long, tiled room, the white tiles cracked and stained yellow. Rusted metal beds lined the walls. Glass cabinets stood with their doors agape, revealing empty, dust-coated shelves. At the far end of the room was the operating theater, separated by a wall of thick, greenish glass. Inside, a single, menacing-looking chair with leather straps sat under a large, multifaceted surgical lamp. Beside it, a metal cart held an array of grim, archaic instruments. As soon as Julian stepped across the threshold, a sharp pain lanced through his skull, starting behind his right eye and radiating outward. It felt like a spike of ice being driven into his brain. He grunted, raising a hand to his temple. The room seemed to tilt, the edges of his vision blurring. Flickering images, gray and indistinct, flashed through his mind. A man struggling in the operating chair. The cold gleam of a long, thin instrument that looked like an ice pick. The clinical, detached face of a doctor, his eyes magnified by thick spectacles. "You okay, man?" Ben Carter was beside him, his camera pointed directly at Julian's face. "You look like you just saw a ghost, which, hey, great content." Julian pushed the camera away. "I'm fine, just a headache." He felt a phantom chill creep across the side of his head, a specific, localized coldness, as if a piece of freezing metal were being pressed against his skin just above the temple. It was the ghost of a sensation, a memory that wasn't his. He stumbled back, leaning against the cold tile wall, trying to breathe through the pain. Dr. Volkov was a pioneer in what he called psychocorrectional surgery, Vadian explained, his voice echoing in the tiled space. He believed that dissent was a pathological disease of the frontal lobe. His methods were unorthodox. Ben, ever the showman, strode into the operating theater. "Time for my close-up," he declared, hopping onto the operating table and lying back with a grin. "How do I look?" ready to be cured of my capitalist tendencies. The instant his back touched the cracked leather, the overhead surgical lamp flickered violently. It buzzed, a sound like an angry hornet, and then the single fluorescent strip lighting the main room went out, plunging them into shadow. A woman on the tour screamed. "Old wiring," Vadian said calmly in the near darkness. "It is a common occurrence." From a high shelf against the far wall, a heavy stainless steel tray loaded with glass jars suddenly slid forward. It tipped over the edge and crashed to the floor, shattering with a deafening explosion of sound. Glass skittered across the tiles. Ben yelped and scrambled off the table, his bravado gone. The fluorescent light flickered back on, its hum louder now. The room was the same, save for the glittering blanket of broken glass on the floor. Vadian did not seem concerned. "As I said," he continued smoothly, "an old building. Please watch your step." The tour group, unnerved, shuffled out of the infirmary quickly. Julian, still disoriented by the headache, found himself at the back. He paused in the doorway, the pain in his head slowly subsiding to a dull throb. He felt a compulsion to look back into the operating theater. He heard a sound, a soft, wet scrape, the sound of a shoe on the glass-strewn floor. He froze, his senses on high alert. He was alone. The rest of the group was already halfway down the corridor. He heard it again, scrape, step, a slow, methodical footstep from inside the theater. He peered through the greenish glass, his heart pounding. The room was empty. A voice, thin and dry as rustling paper, whispered directly behind him. It was a clinical, cruel whisper, heavy with academic disdain. "Paatse iya intain om ye irte ideya veyate yesyamyeri." Patient number 397. Julian spun around, a cry strangling in his throat. The corridor was empty. The sound of the tour group's chatter was fading around a distant corner. He was completely alone, or he was supposed to be. He backed away from the infirmary door, his eyes wide, scanning the long, shadowy hallway. He broke into a run, his boots slapping against the concrete, the sound echoing unnaturally in the sudden silence. As he reached the corner, he risked a glance over his shoulder. For a heartbeat, reflected in the grimy glass of a fire hose cabinet, he saw it. A tall, gaunt figure in a long, white doctor's coat stood in the infirmary doorway, watching him. Its form was indistinct, wavering like heat haze, but its stillness was absolute, its presence radiating a chilling, predatory intelligence. Julian turned and ran, not stopping until he caught up with the lights and sounds of the living. Chapter 4. A script written in scars. Julian retreated to his room, telling the others that his headache had worsened. In truth, the headache was gone, replaced by a cold, creeping dread that felt like a living thing in his gut. He tried to rationalize what happened. The building was old. The sounds were tricks of the wind. The reflection was a play of light and shadow on dirty glass. But he couldn't rationalize the voice. He couldn't explain away the scraped skin on his knuckles or the alien handwriting in his notebook. He decided to work. Work was control. He sat at the small desk, his film script open before him, and tried to immerse himself in the character of Dmitri. He picked up his pen to make notes in the margin, to jot down a sensory detail, an insight. His fingers tightened around the pen, the grip unnaturally strong. His hand began to move across the page, but the motions were not his own. They were jerky, forceful. He wasn't writing, he was carving. The nib of the pen dug into the paper, leaving a deep, black furrow. He tried to lift his hand to stop it, but he couldn't. His muscles refused his commands. It was like watching someone else's limb attached to his body. He stared, his breath hitched in his throat as his own hand moved with a furious, desperate energy, filling the page not with actors' notes but with dense blocks of Cyrillic text. It was poetry. Savage, beautiful, and filled with a rage that seemed to steam off the page. When the last word was finished, the pen stopped. His hand fell limp, the pen clattering onto the desk. He flexed his fingers, a sense of control slowly returning. The muscles in his forearm ached from the strain. He stared at the page, at the angry, foreign words that had poured out of him. It was a violation, an invasion. A soft knock came at his door. He startled, quickly closing the notebook. "Who is it?" "It's Lena Marku. May I come in?" He hesitated, then opened the door. She stood there holding a tablet computer. Her expression was troubled. "I am sorry to bother you," she began, "but I found something I thought. I don't know what I thought." She stepped inside and Julian closed the door. She held out the tablet. On the screen was a grainy, black-and-white photograph. It was a formal portrait of a young man with dark, intense eyes and a defiant set to his jaw. He was handsome, but his face was an unsettling mixture of sensitivity and barely contained fury. "My university has access to some declassified state archives," she explained, her voice low. "It took some digging, but I found his file. This is him, my great-uncle, Ivan Koslov." Julian stared at the photograph. He felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, a sickening lurch of recognition. He knew those eyes. He had seen them that morning, staring back at him from his own reflection in the mirror. "The name," Julian whispered, his voice hoarse. "Ivan, the name of the poet. The name he had researched for his role was Dmitri Volkov, a fictional composite, but this man, this Ivan, was real." "Is something wrong?" Lena asked, seeing the color drain from his face. What did his poetry sound like?" Julian asked, his mind racing. "It was called seditious. They said it was filled with the poison of individualism." She swiped the screen, bringing up a block of text. Cyrillic characters, the same sharp, angular script as the writing in his notebook. Julian grabbed his notebook from the desk, his hands shaking, and held it open next to the tablet. The handwriting was identical. The poems were identical. Lena gasped, her eyes darting from the tablet to the notebook and then to Julian's pale face. How did you do that? Do you speak Russian?" "No," Julian said, the word barely a breath. "No, I don't." He collapsed onto the edge of his bed, the notebook slipping from his fingers. It was real. A man named Ivan Koslov was haunting this room. He was haunting him. As the afternoon bled into a long, gray evening, the possession became more tangible. It was no longer confined to dreams and automatic writing. It was in his body. He began to walk with a slight limp, favoring his left leg, though he had no injury. A dry, hacking cough started in his chest, and when he coughed, he could taste the faint, coppery tang of old blood and cheap tobacco on his tongue. He found himself rubbing his wrists, which ached with the memory of chains. These were not actors' choices. These were scars imprinted on his nervous system. He was a vessel, and Ivan Koslov was pouring himself in, displacing Julian ounce by ounce. He tried to fight it. He paced the small room, speaking his own name over and over, a desperate mantra against the rising tide. My name is Julian Croft. I am an actor. I am from London. He stopped in front of the window, staring out at the darkening taiga. The rooks were gone. He was alone with the ghost in his head. He recited the words again, trying to make them solid, to make them true. I am Julian Croft. He felt a cold tingling in his jaw, a shifting of muscles in his throat. His own mouth opened, and a voice emerged, low and gravelly, like stones grinding together. It was a voice ruined by shouting and thickened by cold. It spoke in perfect, unaccented Russian, a language he did not know. Nayat. The voice vibrated through his own bones, a foreign power using his larynx as its instrument. Ty Stranitsa, Yachur Nila. Julian stared at his reflection in the dark glass, his body rigid with a terror beyond anything he had ever imagined. He did not need a translator. He understood the meaning perfectly. No, you are the page, I am the ink. Chapter 5, Paper Ghosts. Terror was a sharp, cold thing. It cleared Julian's head, cutting through the fog of denial. He was not going mad. He was being overwritten. He flung his door open and ran down the hall to Lena's room, hammering on the wood with the flat of his hand. She opened it a moment later, her face etched with concern. Julian, what is it? You have to believe me, he said, his voice ragged. He's in my head, Ivan, I can hear him, I can feel him. She looked at his frantic eyes, at the genuine panic etched on his face, and nodded slowly, pulling him into her room. I believe you, she said, her voice steady. After what I saw, the handwriting, I believe you. His story tumbled out, the dream, the scraped knuckles, the voice in the infirmary, and the final, terrifying pronouncement in his own throat. Lena listened without interruption, her expression growing more grim with every word. My great uncle was not a quiet man, she said when he finished. His letters, the ones that got through to my grandmother, they were filled with defiance. He refused to be a victim. He fought them until the very end. What did they do to him? Julian asked, dreading the answer. The files are heavily redacted. They mention sustained re-educational therapy and non-compliance. They mention Dr. Volkov by name. And then, in the winter of 1953, the entries just stop. He is listed as resolved. Resolved, Julian repeated, the bureaucratic euphemism chilling him to the bone. We need to find something. Something that proves what happened here. Something that explains why he's still here. The manager, Vadian, he will not help us, Lena said. He is part of this place, he protects it. An idea began to form in Julian's mind. It wasn't his idea. It felt like an instinct, a piece of knowledge planted deep in his subconscious, a memory. The administrative wing, he said. The letters. He wrote letters that were never sent. They kept them. How do you know that? "I just know," he said. "He knows." They waited until after midnight, when the long corridors were silent, and the only sound was the groan of the building settling in the cold. Armed with a small flashlight from Lena's bag, they moved like thieves through the sleeping hotel. The administrative wing on the ground floor was roped off with a faded velvet rope. They slipped under it. The air here was different, drier. It smelled of decaying paper and dead ambition. They moved down a corridor lined with empty offices, the doors hanging open on rusted hinges. Julian felt a strange pull, a homing instinct, drawing him toward a specific room at the end of the hall. Pavel, the silent groundskeeper, was standing there. He emerged from the shadows, holding a heavy wrench, and for a moment Julian's heart seized. But the old man simply looked at them, his eyes dark and knowing in his weathered face. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, then turned and walked away, melting back into the darkness. He had not been guarding the room, he had been waiting for them. The office was a disaster of overturned furniture and scattered files. "He's showing me," Julian whispered, his gaze fixed on a section of the wall beside a large metal filing cabinet. He hid things. He worked sanitation duty. He knew the building's secrets. He ran his hands over the peeling plaster. His fingers found a loose spot. He pulled. A square section of the wall came away, revealing a dark, musty cavity. Inside was a dirty canvas mailbag. With trembling hands, Julian pulled it out. It was heavy. He untied the drawstring and tipped the contents onto the floor. A cascade of letters, dozens of them, bundled in twine. The ink was faded, the paper yellowed and brittle. They sat on the dusty floor, using the flashlight's beam to read. They were Ivan Koslov's unsent correspondence, letters to his wife, his son, his sister. They were filled with heartbreaking declarations of love and desperate attempts at hope. But there was more. Between the lines of family news, he had chronicled his life in the sanatorium. He wrote of the crushing labor, the starvation rations, the psychological torture. And he wrote with venomous clarity about Dr. Gennady Volkov. He detailed the doctor's treatments, the ice water baths, the injections of unknown substances, the nights spent chained in the infirmary while Volkov whispered questions in his ear. These were not the writings of a man being broken. They were the testimony of a man forging his rage into a weapon. As Julian read the descriptions of Volkov's cruelty, the air in the room dropped in temperature. A profound cold seeped from the walls, a cold that had nothing to do with the Siberian night. Lena shivered, pulling her coat tighter. "Do you feel that?" she whispered. Julian looked up from a letter. A faint, white mist was bleeding from the corners of the room, pooling on the floor like dry ice. The beam of their flashlight began to flicker. "We have an audience," Julian said, his voice low. The words were his, but the cold certainty behind them belonged to Ivan. "The doctor doesn't like his secrets being read." The ghost of Dr. Volkov manifested, not as a reflection or a whisper, but as a defined presence in the center of the room. He was a pillar of shimmering cold, a distortion in the air that was vaguely man-shaped. The smell of formaldehyde and ozone became overpowering. He was not focused on Julian. His predatory attention was fixed on Lena, the contaminant, the witness. The room began to shake. Files flew from the cabinets, papers swirling in a vortex of unseen energy. Lena cried out as the spectral cold washed over her, and she collapsed, clutching her head, her breath turning to frost in the air. Seeing her fall, something inside Julian snapped. The fear vanished, replaced by a white-hot surge of pure, defiant rage. It was Ivan's rage, his final, unbroken fury. He rose to his feet, his body thrumming with a power that was not his own. The ghost of the doctor turned its attention to him, a wave of psychic pressure washing over him, filled with clinical hatred. Julian opened his mouth and screamed. It was not a scream of fear, but a roar of rebellion. He screamed a line of poetry from the letter in his hand, a verse about a soul that would never kneel. He screamed it in Russian, the words tearing from his throat, raw and powerful. The apparition of Volkov recoiled as if struck by a physical blow. It flickered violently, its form destabilizing. The vortex of papers fell to the floor. The intense cold receded. The room fell silent. Julian stood panting, his borrowed voice echoing in the stillness. A terrifying, exhilarating power coursed through his veins. He had fought a ghost and won. Lena pushed herself up, staring at him. Her eyes were wide, her fear now a terrible, conflicted thing. It was a fear no longer just for the ghost, but for the man standing before her. He was not Julian Croft. Not anymore. Something powerful and ancient and full of rage was looking out at her through his eyes. Chapter 6. The ink spreads. The echoes of Julian's defiant scream faded, leaving a silence in the record's office that was heavier and more profound than before. The oppressive cold receded like a low tide, and the whirlwind of paper settled into a dead, dusty calm. Lena pushed herself into a sitting position, her breath plumbing in the frigid air. She stared at Julian, not with gratitude but with a new, sharper fear. The man who had faced down a spectral entity was not the same man she'd met on the bus. The actor was gone. In his place stood something hard and unforgiving, his posture rigid, his eyes burning with an ancient fire. Then the fire banked. The tension in his shoulders eased, and the ferocious energy that had radiated from him collapsed inward. He swayed on his feet, his face going slack with shock and exhaustion. He looked down at his own hands as if they were foreign objects. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice returning to its normal pitch though it was strained and weak. "Did you feel it?" "I saw it," Lena said, her voice a tremor. She got to her feet, careful to keep a small distance between them. "What was that, Julian? The way you shouted, the language." "It wasn't me, it was him," he said, pressing the heels of his hands to his temples. "He used me, the rage, it felt liberating. For a second I wasn't scared." He looked at her, his expression a mixture of awe and self-revulsion. "And that scares me more than anything." They gathered the letters, stuffing the brittle pages back into the canvas bag. Every rustle of paper seemed unnaturally loud in the charged silence. They said nothing as they crept back through the sleeping sanatorium, the building a silent, concrete witness to their transgression. Back in the relative safety of Lena's room, she locked the door and slid a chair under the handle. It was a flimsy defense, but the ritual seemed necessary. She spread the letters across her small bed, arranging them by date, her historian's instincts taking over. Julian paced the small space, too agitated to sit. He felt like a live wire, the phantom energy of Ivan's rage still humming beneath his skin. "He's getting stronger," Julian said, running a hand through his hair. "It's not just memories anymore, it's motor control, instincts. When I was in that office, I knew exactly where to look for the letters. I knew Volkov was coming before he appeared. It's like his memories of this place are mapping themselves onto my brain." Lena picked up a letter, its edges crumbling. "We need to understand what he wants. A ghost, a spirit. They are often tied to a place by injustice, by unfinished business. You repelled Volkov by using Ivan's own words. His defiance is your only weapon against the doctor." "It feels like I'm trying to put out a fire using gasoline," Julian muttered. "Perhaps, but it's the only tool we have." She scanned the page, her finger tracing the angry Cyrillic script. "He mentions other prisoners, a musician named Sasha, a painter, Mikko. He writes about a plan, a way to get a message out, a collection of their works, poems, drawings, a symphony, a testament to their survival. He called it the Dissenter's Folio." While Lena read, Julian felt a new set of changes ripple through him. A dull, persistent ache settled into his lower back, the phantom pain of years spent sleeping on a thin cot. He felt an inexplicable craving for the coarse, black bread they served in the canteen. When he looked at the bottle of water on Lena's nightstand, he felt a ghost of thirst so profound it made his throat click. He was inheriting a body's history. The changes were not just physical. Looking around Lena's small room, he saw it through Ivan's eyes. The single window was an escape route, too small. The door was a weak point. The hollow space under the floorboards was a potential hiding place. The sanatorium was no longer a hotel. It was a prison, and every architectural detail was a part of the cage. Down the hall, another guest was having his own authentic experience. Ben Carter sat in the dark of his room, headphones clamped over his ears. He had found a small box of reel-to-reel tapes in a supposedly sealed-off storage closet, labeled only with patient numbers. He had spent a small fortune on a portable player for just such a find. This was it, the real stuff, the content that would make his channel explode. He pressed play. Hiss and static filled his ears, then a calm, dry voice. Dr. Volkov's voice. It was a recording of a psychocorrectional session. The doctor's questions were clinical, repetitive. The patient's answers were mumbled, frightened. But beneath the audible conversation there was something else. A low, subsonic hum. A frequency that vibrated deep in his bones, making his teeth ache. He couldn't understand the Russian, but the emotion was universal. He leaned closer to the machine, cranking the volume, completely absorbed. The hum deepened. He didn't notice the temperature in his room begin to drop. He didn't see the way the shadows in the corners seemed to coalesce and darken. He was listening to the authentic sound of a mind being methodically dismantled, and he felt a strange, thrilling connection to the power of the man conducting the session. It felt clean, orderly. Back in Lena's room, Julian stopped packing. He stared at the door, his head cocked. Someone is watching us. The feeling was a prickle of cold on his neck, an instinct Ivan had honed over years of surveillance. Lena looked up from the letters, her eyes wide. "Who?" "Vadiano." They fell silent, listening. There was no sound from the corridor, but the feeling of being observed was undeniable. A cold, patient scrutiny. The manager wasn't just a hotelier. He was a warden, a curator of the misery that soaked the walls. Lena gathered the letters, her hands moving with a new sense of urgency. His goal, she said, her voice a low whisper. The folio. He and the others were going to smuggle it out. A final act of defiance. But the records show there was a search, a crackdown in the week before his file ends. They must have found it. That's what broke him. That's why he's still here. His life's work, their collective hope, was silenced. Julian walked to the window and stared out into the impenetrable darkness of the taiga. He felt a profound, aching sadness wash over him, a grief so deep it was almost bottomless. It was Ivan's grief, the loss of his art, the failure of his rebellion. It was a wound that had never healed, a pain that had tethered him to this concrete tomb for 70 years. He placed a hand on the cold glass of the window pane. In the faint reflection, he saw his own face, but the expression was not his. It was a look of grim, unyielding resolve. A flicker of a smile, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, touched the lips of the man in the glass. Ivan Koslov's final poem was not yet written. His rebellion was not over. The sanatorium had taken his life, but he had found a new vessel. He would have his final say. The goal was no longer escape. It was retribution. Chapter 7. Echoes in the Wires. The next day, Ben Carter was a changed man. The boisterous, cynical vlogger was gone, replaced by a tense, quietly obsessive figure. He barely touched his breakfast, his eyes darting around the canteen, studying the other guests with a disquieting intensity. He had his headphones on, the wire snaking into his coat pocket where the reel-to-reel player was constantly running. He was listening to Volkov's tapes, and the cold logic of the doctor was seeping into his thoughts. Julian and Lena watched him from across the room. "Something is wrong with him," Lena murmured, pushing her untouched porridge around her bowl. "This place is a contagion," Julian said, his voice low. "Ivan is not the only ghost here. Volkov is active. He found a new patient." Ivan's memories supplied the context. The doctor had always been adept at finding the weakest mind in a group and turning it to his purpose. Their purpose for the day was clear. The letters mention Volkov's obsession with control, Lena said, keeping her voice down. He didn't just use surgery and drugs. He wrote about environmental therapy, altering light, sound, temperature. He needed a central point to manage it all. "The basement," Julian supplied, the word coming to him with an unnerving certainty. "The heart of the machine." Getting there was a risk. The lower levels were strictly off-limits, the stairwell door secured with a heavy padlock. But Ivan's memory provided the key. There was another way. A service elevator at the far end of the 7th floor, hidden behind a panel in a linen closet. It hadn't worked in 50 years, but the shaft was still there, with a maintenance ladder running its entire length. They found it exactly where Julian, where Ivan, knew it would be. Prying open the panel revealed a dark, narrow shaft that smelled of rust and stagnant water. The darkness was absolute. "You can't be serious," Lena whispered, peering into the abyss. "He used this shaft to move between floors to listen," Julian said. "He knew every secret of this building. He tested the iron ladder. It was slick with grime but held firm. With the small flashlight clenched in his teeth, he began to descend into the guts of the sanatorium. Lena, after a moment of profound hesitation, followed. The descent was terrifying. Each rung was a small victory against the oppressive darkness and the groaning sounds of the building around them. 7 floors down, they found the basement access door, its hinges stiff with rust. It opened with a tortured shriek of metal. The basement was a labyrinth of concrete pillars and dripping pipes. The air was thick and cold, heavy with the smell of damp earth and decay. Following Ivan's unerring sense of direction, Julian led them through the maze to a reinforced steel door marked with a faded red warning symbol. The door was locked. Julian examined the heavy, industrial lock and a memory surfaced. He saw Ivan's hands, nimble and sure, picking a similar lock with a piece of scavenged wire. Julian pulled 2 sturdy hairpins from Lena's hair. His fingers, clumsy and alien to the task moments before, suddenly moved with an unfamiliar dexterity. He inserted the pins into the lock, twisting and probing. The tumblers clicked, one by one. The lock sprang open. Lena stared, her mouth agape. "How did you?" "He learned," Julian said simply. The room beyond was a technological crypt. Racks of obsolete electronic equipment stood like steel skeletons, draped in cobwebs. The centerpiece was a massive, primitive computer, a wall of vacuum tubes, punch card readers, and thick, bundled cables that snaked into the walls like metallic roots. A single, ominous red light glowed on a central panel. Some part of it was still alive. "My God," Lena breathed. "This must be it, the control system." On a dusty console, they found schematics and logbooks. Dr. Volkov's meticulous notes detailed his system. He could subtly alter the frequency of the electrical hum in the lights, pump subsonic frequencies through the ventilation, and create minute temperature variations from room to room. It was a machine designed to fray nerves, induce paranoia, and break the will of the inmates on a subliminal level. The warden's algorithm. As Lena pored over the documents, Julian was drawn to the punch card reader. A single card was still loaded in the tray. He pulled it out. It was a sequence of holes, not a program but a command, an instruction. A loud click echoed through the room. The glowing red light on the central panel began to blink faster and faster. The vacuum tubes flickered to life, casting an eerie orange glow. The machine was waking up. "What did you do?" Lena asked, looking up from the logbooks. "I didn't do anything," Julian said, his eyes wide. "It knows we're here." The haunting began. The overhead lights in the basement didn't just flicker. They began to pulse in a sickening, disorienting rhythm. A low hum emanated from the walls, the same frequency Ben had been listening to, rising in pitch until it felt like a drill boring into their skulls. Then a sound crackled to life from a speaker on the wall, part of the building's old public address system. It was the recording from Volkov's tape. A patient's terrified weeping, followed by the doctor's calm, chilling voice. "The subject resists reclamation. The pathology is deep-seated. We will proceed to the next phase." The voice echoed through the basement, amplified and distorted. It wasn't just a recording anymore. It was a declaration. Volkov's ghost, using the machine as his nervous system had found them. The steel door slammed shut, the heavy bolt sliding home with a deafening clang. They were trapped. The subsonic hum intensified, making their bones vibrate. The recorded screams grew louder, a cacophony of disembodied suffering. It was a full-scale psychological assault, the sanatorium's immune system attacking the intruders. Lena crumpled to the floor, her hands over her ears, her face pale with nausea. Julian fought to stay on his feet, the noise and pressure threatening to tear his mind apart. But through the pain, Ivan's rage surged. This machine, this engine of suffering, was the instrument of his tormentor. He controlled it all from here, Julian yelled over the din, the words fueled by Ivan's fury. The power, it all runs through here. He followed a thick bundle of cables from the central computer to a large, rusted junction box on the wall. This was the heart. He grabbed a heavy iron pipe lying amidst the debris on the floor, his muscles bunching with borrowed strength. This was not about escape. This was about destruction. He raised the pipe and brought it down with all his might against the junction box. The metal screamed and buckled. He struck it again and again, a frantic, desperate rhythm of demolition. The recorded screams on the PA system began to warp, stretching into a demonic shriek of feedback. On the final, crushing blow, the box tore from its mountings in a shower of sparks. The PA system died. The pulsing lights went out, plunging them into darkness. The subsonic hum ceased. Silence, sudden and complete, rushed in to fill the void. For a moment they stood in the pitch black, panting. Then, from the floors above, they heard a new sound. A furious, human scream of rage, followed by the crash of a door being thrown open. "He's coming," Lena whispered in the dark. The power surge had blown the circuits in Ben Carter's room, cutting off his precious recording mid-session. In his paranoid, manipulated mind, it was not an accident. It was a deliberate attack. They were trying to silence the doctor. They were trying to steal his story. "You can't have it," Ben's voice echoed down the elevator shaft. "It's mine. I'll kill you." His heavy footsteps thundered on the stairs above, coming closer. Chapter 8: The Gallery of the Damned. The beam of their flashlight cut a frantic path through the darkness as Julian wrestled with the jammed basement door. Ben's enraged shouts grew louder, a wild litany of accusations and garbled psychiatric terms echoing from the stairwell. The subject exhibits antisocial tendencies. Containment protocol is authorized. "He's completely lost it," Lena breathed, her back pressed against the cold concrete wall. The bolt on the door wouldn't budge. The power surge had fused it. "We're trapped," Julian said, his voice grim. Ivan's mind, a repository of prison break strategies, searched for another way out. The ventilation shafts. They were small, foul, but they were a way. He found the access grate near the ceiling, its bolts rusted tight. Using the iron pipe as a lever, he put all his weight into it. Metal shrieked and groaned. With a final, agonized crack, one side of the grate tore loose. It was just large enough to squeeze through. He helped Lena up first, then scrambled in after her, pulling the damaged grate back into a semblance of its original position just as Ben's heavy fists began to pound on the other side of the steel door. The vents were a claustrophobic hell of sheet metal and darkness. They crawled on hands and knees through a century of dust and grime, the sound of their own ragged breathing unnaturally loud. Julian led the way, guided by Ivan's intimate knowledge of the sanatorium's hidden anatomy. He was looking for a specific place, a sanctuary where Volkov's cold, orderly influence was weakest. After a crawl that felt like an eternity, he stopped above a vertical shaft. "Here," he whispered, his voice muffled by the tight space. He couldn't stand this place. Too much chaos. He kicked out a rusted screen and dropped into the room below, landing with a soft thud on something that crunched like old canvas. Lena followed a moment later. They were in the sealed art therapy wing. The room was vast, a former ballroom, its high windows boarded over. Dust motes danced in the single beam of their flashlight. The space was a forest of shrouded figures, sculptures, and stacked canvases hidden under graying drop cloths. The air was still and dry, thick with the scent of turpentine, linseed oil, and something else. A faint, electric tang of raw, unbridled emotion. As their eyes adjusted, they began to see what was under the cloths. This was where the sanatorium's artists had poured out their souls. There were paintings of screaming faces dissolving into abstract frenzies of color, sculptures of twisted bodies, fashioned from scavenged wire and plumbing fixtures, reached for a sky they would never see. Clay busts with hollow eyes lined the shelves. It was a gallery of captured agony. As they moved deeper into the room, a low hum started, not the mechanical hum of the basement, but a sound like 1,000 whispered conversations happening just out of earshot. It was the psychic residue of every artist who had ever worked in this room, their defiance and despair soaked into the very objects they had created. The dissenters' choir. "This is it," Lena whispered, her voice filled with awe and horror. "The folio. It wasn't a document, it was this room, all of this." Julian was drawn to a corner where a series of sculptures stood apart from the others. They were made of rusted bed springs and sharpened scraps of metal, twisted into stark, beautiful shapes that spoke of birds and broken wings. "Ivan," he said. The knowledge was absolute. He ran his hand over one of the pieces, and a wave of profound sorrow washed over him, the memory of a creator's hands shaping his last, defiant testament. It was a sadness so pure it momentarily eclipsed the rage. He saw, for the first time, the man Ivan was before the anger consumed him. A loud crash from the corridor outside shattered the moment. Ben had found them. He threw his shoulder against the barricaded door. The old wood splintered. "Nowhere to run," he snarled from the other side. "The doctor needs to see you for your evaluation." Julian pushed Lena behind a large, sheet-draped sculpture. The whispers in the room grew louder, more agitated. The air crackled. The choir was reacting to the intrusion, to the scent of Volkov's influence clinging to Ben. The door burst inward with a splintering roar. Ben stood in the doorway, a wild silhouette against the dim light of the hall. He held a heavy, iron fire extinguisher in his hands, hefting it like a club. His eyes were wide and unfocused, his face a mask of paranoid fury. "Non-compliant elements must be purged," he chanted, his voice a grotesque mimicry of the one from the tapes. He took a step into the room, his boots crunching on the debris. As he crossed the threshold, the room came alive. The whispers rose to a roar of discordant voices. The dropped cloths on the sculptures billowed and stirred as if in a strong wind. The painted eyes on the canvases seemed to follow him, their expressions turning from agony to malice. Ben faltered, his madness momentarily giving way to fear. What? What is this? This is their room, Ben, Julian said, stepping out from behind the sculpture. And you are not welcome here. Ivan's defiance blazed in his eyes. Ben screamed and charged, swinging the fire extinguisher. Julian dodged, the heavy canister whistling past his head and smashing into a plaster bust, which exploded in a cloud of white dust. The room itself seemed to join the fight. A stack of canvases tipped over, sliding toward Ben and tripping him. He stumbled, catching himself before he fell. As he turned to swing at Julian again, a tall, skeletal sculpture made of intertwined pipes and wire began to vibrate, emitting a low, mournful tone like a cello string. Ben lunged, not at Julian but at Lena, who was cowering behind the sculpture. He saw her as the source of the corruption, the historian interfering with the doctor's work. As he raised the extinguisher to strike, another sculpture, a heavy, life-sized figure of a man carved from a solid block of wood, toppled from its pedestal. It fell in slow motion, crashing down onto Ben's back with a sickening crunch. He collapsed, the fire extinguisher clattering to the floor. He lay still, unconscious, a dark stain spreading on the floor beneath his head. The room fell silent. The whispers died down. The sense of motion ceased. Julian and Lena stood panting in the aftermath, surrounded by the silent, watching art. But the quiet did not last. The whispers started again, soft at first, then growing in strength. They were different now. They weren't just an ambient chorus. They were focused. They were directed at Julian. They recognized Ivan's spirit within him. They saw him not as a vessel, but as a leader, a conduit. They were 100 voices of rebellion, 100 currents of rage and sorrow, and they were all flowing toward him, seeking to add their power to his. He felt their pain, their defiance, their madness, all trying to pour into the vessel that was once Julian Croft. He gasped, staggering back, clutching his head as a cacophony of shattered minds rushed in. Ivan was no longer the only ghost in his machine. He was becoming a living archive of the sanatorium's descent. He was becoming a legion. Chapter 9: A Chorus of Scars. The cacophony in Julian's head was a tidal wave of shattered consciousness. He was no longer just Ivan Koslov. He was Sasha, the musician, hearing phantom symphonies in the building's groans. He was Mikhail, the painter, seeing the world as layers of decaying pigment and screaming, silent forms. He was 100 others, their individual traumas, their small, desperate hopes, and their burning resentments all crashing against the shores of his mind. He stumbled back, his hands pressed to his ears as if he could physically block the intrusion. He saw flashes of their lives, a child's face, a lover's touch, the brutal swing of a guard's baton, the cold prick of Volkov's needle. The sheer volume of suffering was immense, a weight that threatened to crush his own identity into dust. Julian, Lena's voice cut through the noise, a single, clear note in the psychic storm. She grabbed his arm, her grip grounding him. Julian, look at me, fight it. Don't let them consume you. He focused on her face, on the real, tangible fear in her eyes. It was an anchor. He fought to separate himself from the torrent, to become an individual again. They, they think I'm him, he gasped, the words a struggle. They think Ivan has returned to lead them. Through the chaos, Ivan's consciousness asserted itself. It did not fight the others. Instead, it acted as a conductor, shaping the dissonant chorus of pain into a single, resonant chord of pure, focused rage. The individual voices subsided, but their collective strength remained, flowing into Julian, reinforcing him. The fear and confusion were burned away, replaced by an ice-cold, righteous fury. He was no longer a vessel for one ghost. He was the focal point of a spectral revolution. The change in him was palpable. He straightened up, the frantic energy replaced by a deadly calm. He looked down at the unconscious form of Ben Carter, not with pity, but with a cold, tactical assessment. "He's a puppet," Julian said, his voice a low harmony of his own and Ivan. "Volkov is using him. We have to break the connection." He knelt beside Ben. The reel-to-reel player lay on the floor, its tape still spooled. Julian picked it up. He could feel the cold, clinical evil clinging to the object, the psychic residue of Dr. Volkov's malevolent will. This was the tether. "We destroy the tapes," Lena said, understanding immediately. "No," Julian replied, his eyes distant. "Destruction is not enough. We have to show Volkov that his methods no longer work, that his power is broken." He looked around the art gallery at the legion of silent, tormented artworks. "We give the choir a voice." Their plan was desperate, a piece of psychological warfare against a ghost. They carried Ben's unconscious body to the sanatorium's small cinema, a room that hadn't been used in decades. Rows of dusty velvet seats faced a blank, stained screen. At the back of the room, an ancient, hulking film projector sat like a sleeping beast. Lena, using her knowledge of rudimentary electronics, worked on the building's PA system, rerouting wires from the cinema's audio output. Julian, guided by the memories of a prisoner who had once been a projectionist, threaded the reel-to-reel tape into the projector's audio input. Instead of a film, the machine would now play Volkov's session tapes throughout the entire sanatorium. As Julian worked, he felt the other spirits settling within him, their skills becoming his own. Sasha, the musician's sense of rhythm, helped him calibrate the machine's speed. Mikkel, the painter's eye for detail, allowed him to spot a frayed wire others might have missed. He was a mosaic of dead men's talents. They propped Ben in a seat in the front row, facing the empty screen. When everything was ready, Julian stood at the back of the theater, his hand on the projector's main switch. "Are you sure about this?" Lena whispered, her face pale in the gloom. "What is this going to do?" "Volkov's power comes from control, from order, from silence," Julian said, the words flowing with Ivan's certainty. "We're going to give this place a new voice, a voice he can't control." He threw the switch. The projector whirred to life. The amplifier tubes glowed. A loud hiss filled the cinema, and then the PA system crackled to life across the entire sanatorium. It started with Dr. Volkov's voice, cold and clinical, echoing through the empty halls, the canteen, the infirmary. The subject resists reclamation. We will proceed to the next phase. In the cinema, Ben Carter stirred, his head lolling to the side. The familiar voice was reaching him, pulling him back under its influence. Then the choir joined in. It began as a low hum, a soft chorus of whispers emanating from the speakers alongside Volkov's voice. Julian, the conduit, stood with his eyes closed, broadcasting the collected pain of the art gallery through the machine. The whispers grew louder, the voices of the damned rising in unison. They did not scream. They recited poetry, hummed the bars of forgotten symphonies, and described the vibrant colors of a world they had lost. They were broadcasting defiance. The effect on the sanatorium was immediate and violent. The lights flickered and burst, showering the corridors in sparks. The building groaned, a deep structural tremor that shook the foundations. The portraits of the Politburo in the lobby fell from the walls, their canvases slashed by an unseen force. In the infirmary, glass cabinets shattered. The sanatorium, the physical embodiment of Volkov's order, was tearing itself apart under the strain of this spectral rebellion. In the cinema, Volkov's recorded voice began to distort, warped by the chorus of dissent. It glitched and stuttered, overwhelmed by the sheer, beautiful chaos of the art. Ben screamed. He clutched his head, caught in the crossfire of the psychic war. The orderly, controlling voice that had promised him clarity and purpose was being drowned out by an ocean of creative agony. On the blank screen in front of him, an image began to form, not from the projector but from the combined psychic energy of the choir. It was a face, 100 faces, shifting and blending into one another, their eyes filled with sorrow and rage. They were staring directly at Ben. They were showing him what Volkov's cure really looked like. The psychic feedback loop was too much. Ben's eyes rolled back in his head, and he slumped into his seat, truly unconscious this time, the psychic parasite violently exorcised from his mind. Julian cut the power. The projector wound down and an abrupt, ringing silence fell over the building. The PA system hissed once, then died. The rebellion was over. The silence that followed felt different. It was not the oppressive, watchful silence of before. It was the calm, empty silence of a battlefield after the fighting has stopped. Julian leaned against the projector, drained. He had been a conduit for a storm, and the effort had hollowed him out. His own identity felt thin, a fragile membrane stretched over the seething energies of the others. "Did it work?" Lena asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We broke his hold," Julian said. "On Ben, on the building, but he's not gone. We just made him angry." As if in answer, a new sound reached them, faint but clear. It came from the lobby, the slow, methodical ticking of a clock that had not worked in 70 years. It was a sound of order, a sound of patience. Volkov was weakened, but he was regrouping. And he was now focused entirely on them. Chapter 10: The Warden and the Beast. They found Ben Carter still unconscious but breathing steadily. The manic, paranoid energy was gone, leaving him looking pale and diminished. They left him in the cinema and made their way cautiously back towards the main floors. The sanatorium was a wreck. Shattered glass littered the floors, and a deep, resonant hum vibrated through the concrete, the building's death rattle. The ticking was louder now, a steady, inexorable heartbeat pulling them toward the lobby. Mr. Vadian was waiting for them there. He stood behind the reception desk, calmly polishing a glass with a white cloth. Behind him, the grandfather clock on the wall, a relic that had been a silent monument, was now working perfectly, its great brass pendulum swinging in a hypnotic arc. A most impressive performance, Vadian said without looking up. His placid smile was gone, replaced by an expression of weary disappointment, like a teacher whose prize students had cheated on an exam. You have disturbed the equilibrium. Dr. Volkov is displeased. Who are you? Lena demanded, her voice shaking but firm. What are you? I am the caretaker, Vadian replied, setting the glass down with a soft click. My family has watched over this place since the doctor's work began. We maintain the balance. We ensure the silence. He finally raised his eyes to meet theirs. His pupils were unnaturally dilated, black pools of utter emptiness. You have given the inmates a voice. That is not permitted. The doctor's purpose is to bring order to chaos, to cure. You call that a cure? Julian spat, the rage of the choir flaring within him. It was torture. It was murder. The concepts are irrelevant, Vadiana said, his voice as cold as the concrete walls. There is only the pathology and the treatment. You, actor, have become the primary infection. You house the chaos. You must be treated. The lobby doors burst open. Pavel, the groundskeeper, stood there, his face grim. He held a heavy, double-bitted axe in one hand and a lit kerosene lantern in the other. He didn't look at them. He looked past them, at the deep woods that pressed in around the sanatorium. It comes, Pavel said, his voice a low rumble. The noise has woken the beast. The forest wants the house back. Vadiano's composure finally broke. A flicker of genuine fear crossed his face. You fool! You have done more than anger the doctor. The psychic chaos you unleashed. It is a beacon, a dinner bell. A low, guttural roar echoed from the taiga, a sound of impossible size and ancient hunger. It was not the sound of any known animal. It was a deep, earth-shaking vibration that made the remaining windows in the lobby rattle in their frames. What is that? Lena asked, her face ashen. The taigas claim, Pavel grunted. The old ones, they sleep under the frost. The house was built on their ground. The misery keeps them fed, but the silence keeps them sleeping. You made too much noise. Vadian moved from behind the desk, his movements suddenly swift and purposeful. The doctor is the only thing that can protect this place. His order is a shield against the chaos outside. You have broken that shield. The building was now caught between two terrifying forces. Inside, the methodical, psychic predator of Dr. Volkov, intent on curing the chaos Julian now embodied. And outside, a primeval physical entity drawn by that same chaos, a thing of claws and hunger that wanted to devour the sanatorium and everyone in it. The front doors, made of heavy oak and reinforced with steel, bulged inward with a deafening crack, splintered by a blow of unimaginable force. Deep gouges, thick as a man's arm, scarred the wood. Pavel raised his axe. Vadian, you kept the bad spirits in. Now you will help me keep the older ones out. Vadian ignored him. His black, empty eyes were fixed on Julian. The only solution is to restore the silence, to remove the source of the infection. The doctor will perform his work and the beast will go back to sleep. He lunged, not with physical force but with a psychic attack. He was a conduit for Volkov, and a wave of pure, orderly silence washed over Julian, attempting to snuff out the chorus of voices in his head. Julian cried out, staggering back as the psychic pressure threatened to obliterate him. But the choir, the legion of defiant souls within him, rose to meet the attack. Their combined rage and sorrow formed a shield of pure emotional chaos, repelling the assault. The roar from outside came again, closer this time, accompanied by the sound of snapping trees. The beast was coming. The final act was beginning. Trapped between the cold, intellectual horror of the sanatorium and the raw, physical terror of the ancient taiga, Julian Croft, the actor who had wanted to borrow a trauma, had become the epicenter of a war between two distinct and terrible nightmares. Chapter 11, the final verse. The sanatorium screamed. It was a symphony of destruction, the deep groan of stressed concrete punctuated by the shriek of twisting metal. The beast of the taiga was no longer scratching at the door, it was tearing the building apart. A massive, taloned limb, covered in what looked like bark and frozen moss, ripped through the wall of the canteen as if it were cardboard, showering the lobby in debris. The air filled with the scent of ancient earth, pine sap, and freshly broken stone. Pavel met the intrusion with a roar of his own, swinging his axe in a wide, desperate arc. He was not trying to kill the creature, an act as futile as trying to fell a mountain with a hatchet, but to drive it back, to protect the threshold. "This house is not yours yet, old one," he bellowed into the howling wind that now blasted through the breach. Meanwhile, the battle for Julian's soul was reaching its crescendo. Vadian, his face a mask of fanatical concentration, pressed his psychic assault. Waves of pure, cold order, the essence of Dr. Volkov's will, washed over Julian, seeking to silence the choir, to lobotomize the spectral rebellion. "Conform," Vadian hissed, his voice a sibilant whisper that seemed to come from all directions at once. "Submit to the treatment. Find peace in silence." Julian was on his knees, the combined identities within him threatening to fragment under the strain. He was Ivan, feeling the cold steel of the operating chair. He was Sasha, hearing his music dissolve into a single monotonous tone. He was Mikhail, seeing his vibrant colors fade to a uniform, lifeless gray. Volkov wasn't just attacking him. He was attacking the very art and individuality of every soul he sheltered. "Lena," Julian choked out, his voice a pained rasp. "The letters, read them." Lena, who had been frozen in terror, was galvanized into action. She fumbled in the canvas bag, pulling out the brittle sheaf of Ivan's last letters. Her hands shook, but her voice was clear and strong as she began to read aloud, projecting over the cacophony of the unfolding chaos. "To my dearest Anya," she began, her voice ringing with emotion. "They have not broken me. They have tempered me. This cage of concrete and ice is not a tomb. It is a crucible. They think they can erase a man, but they do not understand that a word once written can never truly die." As she read, the words of Ivan Koslov acted as a rallying cry for the spirits within Julian. They pushed back against Volkov's oppressive silence, their chorus swelling not with unstructured rage, but with the focused, defiant beauty of the poetry. Julian felt their strength pour into him, a bulwark against the psychic annihilation. He rose to his feet, his eyes blazing. The power of the choir, now channeled through the lens of Ivan's art, was no longer just a shield. It was a weapon. He met Vadiano's empty gaze and for the first time spoke directly to the spirit controlling him. "You failed, Doctor," Julian said, his voice a resonant chord of 100 defiant souls. "You could break their bones and silence their tongues, but you could never touch their words. You could never kill their art." He took a step forward, and the floor around him seemed to darken as the psychic energy coalesced. He was the eye of a storm of ghosts. Outside, Pavel let out a cry of pain as the creature's limb swept back, catching him a glancing blow that sent him flying across the lobby. The beast began to pull itself through the massive hole it had created, its sheer scale impossible, a moving hill of ancient wood, rock, and shadow. "It is over," Vadiana stated, a note of finality in his voice. "The chaos outside will consume the chaos inside. All will be cleansed." He was redirecting his psychic energy, not to attack Julian, but to reinforce the building's structural integrity, to try and hold the beast at bay long enough to complete his treatment. Julian saw his chance. With Volkov's attention divided, he unleashed the full force of the choir. It wasn't a scream or an attack, it was a performance. He recited Ivan's final, unsent poem, a savage, beautiful verse about a caged bird whose song could shatter mountains. The words poured from him, a torrent of 70 years of repressed art and fury. The psychic energy erupted from him in a visible wave, distorting the air. It struck Vadiana not with force but with understanding. For a single, horrifying moment, the caretaker was no longer a vessel for Volkov. He was a receiver for the choir. He felt all of it, every beating, every lost hope, every moment of despair, every spark of defiance. He experienced the combined suffering of every soul the sanatorium had ever claimed in a single, concentrated blast. Vadiana screamed, a raw human sound of pure agony. The connection to Volkov shattered. The black emptiness in his eyes was replaced by a look of utter, soul-shattering horror. He collapsed, his mind broken by the weight of the borrowed trauma he had helped to curate. With its conduit gone, the presence of Dr. Volkov had nowhere to anchor itself. The ticking of the grandfather clock faltered and stopped. The oppressive, orderly cold that had permeated the sanatorium for decades evaporated, leaving only the natural chill of the Siberian night. The ghost of the doctor, without its warden and its machine, was finally, truly silenced. But the beast remained. Its massive, featureless head was now fully inside the lobby, its presence crushing reality itself. It paid no mind to the humans, its attention fixed on Julian. It was drawn to the bright, chaotic beacon of the spectral energy he embodied. It was here to feed. Julian stood his ground, the voices of the choir now whispering a single, unified idea into his mind. An ending, a final verse. The sanatorium was their cage, and it had to be broken. "Lena, Pavel, get out now," Julian commanded. Pavel, clutching his injured arm, grabbed Lena and began dragging her towards a rear service exit. "What are you doing?" she cried, struggling, her eyes fixed on Julian. "Finishing the poem," Julian said, a strange, sad smile on his face. He turned to face the beast. He no longer fought the spirits within him. He let them merge with him completely. He opened the floodgates, allowing the full, undiluted storm of their collective being to consume what was left of Julian Croft. It was an act of ultimate empathy, a willing sacrifice. He was giving them their freedom at the cost of his own existence. The energy that erupted from him was blinding, a nova of pure psychic light. He became a son of ghosts. The beast recoiled, roaring not in anger but in what sounded like pain as the raw, indigestible energy of 100 defiant human souls washed over it. It was not the food it had expected. It was poison. The sanatorium, no longer reinforced by Volkov's will and now the epicenter of a spectral detonation, gave way. The foundations cracked. The concrete pillars shattered. The entire 9-story structure began to collapse inward on itself, a slow, grinding implosion of concrete and steel. The last thing Lena saw before Pavel pulled her through the doorway was Julian, no longer a man but a radiant silhouette, turning to look at her. In that final moment, she saw his face, and for a fraction of a second, the actor's eyes were back, and they were at peace. Then the roof gave way, and the red horizon retreat, the Soviet-era sanatorium for the politically insane, collapsed into a mountain of rubble, burying the beast, the ghosts, and the man who had become their final voice under 100,000 tons of concrete silence. Epilogue. 6 months later, Prague. Lena Marku sat at a small cafe, a cup of tea steaming in her hands. The tremor she'd had for weeks after the event had finally subsided. Pavel had gotten her to a remote logging town, and from there, back to civilization. The official story was a gas explosion caused by deteriorating pipes. The Red Horizon retreat and its handful of guests, including the promising actor Julian Croft and the obnoxious vlogger Ben Carter, were wiped from existence. No one asked too many questions about a forgotten relic in the heart of Siberia. On the table in front of her was a new book, freshly printed. Its cover was stark and simple, The Dissenter's Folio by Ivan Koslov. After she returned, she had started writing. From memory, she transcribed every poem, every verse she had read in the letters, every line Julian had recited. She wrote down the story of Sasha's symphony and Mikhail's paintings. She wrote everything. She had sent it to a small, independent publisher under Ivan's name, with a short, anonymous foreword explaining its discovery. It was not a bestseller, but it had found an audience. Critics praised its raw power, its untamed, defiant spirit. Ivan Koslov, a man erased by history, was finally being read. His words, which he had believed died with him in the cold, had found their way out. Lena took a sip of her tea and looked out at the bustling city square. She thought of Julian, the actor who had gone looking for a role and had found a purpose. He had not stolen a trauma, he had shouldered it, and in his final, selfless act he had set it free. His performance was over, but the words, Ivan's words, Julian's words, their words, they would live forever. The ink had finally dried. The end.